So they were dealing with a quarry that was about to be built in western Pennsylvania, which is farmland and traditional family farms, and actually a very red area, people with big belt buckles and quite conservative views. And the people said, if this is really just this losing game, why are we doing it? Why can't we do something else? And they said, why don't we give nature rights? And that was where that work started in 2006 in this very conservative community, in Pennsylvania. And it really caught my attention. And it flips the paradigm. Nature now is property. You can go buy this house or this place or whatever it is and do whatever you want. And what this does is, in fact, nature doesn't belong to us. We belong to nature, which is, of course, a deeply indigenous viewpoint as well. And it flips the legal paradigm completely away from nature as property to nature as rights-bearing. And as human beings, we can act as trustees. And at the time, it's one of these things that, forget being on the radar screen. You might as well be a UFO. I mean, basically, in terms of any credibility or possibility that this could ever go anywhere. And over time, we've stayed with it and just watched it now become the fastest growing environmental movement in history. It's stunning.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Kenny Ausubel, co-founder and CEO of Bioneers. We had this conversation right after the Bioneers 2023 conference in Berkeley. And I love how he starts off with the comment that he sees many things going right in this moment. In this discussion, we cover a range of topics, including the rise of the rights of nature movement, how Kenny has a skill for seeing trends early, Bioneers' emphasis on indigenous and native peoples, the importance of youth voices and gender equity and women's leadership. How do we enact change at a local and bioregional level? The role of civic society, Bioneers' learning resources and media platform, and much, much more. I'm really grateful to Kenny for sitting down and having this discussion, especially right after the conference. On to the conversation with Kenny Ausubel. We're here with Kenny Ausubel. Kenny is the founder and CEO of Bioneers. Welcome, Kenny.
I'm glad to be here, Matthew. Thank you. Great to see you.
And you've just come off of fresh Bioneers. We're the day after the conference. How are you feeling?
Dazed and confused, but very happy. No, things went well.
So how many Bioneers have happened now?
This was 34.
34.
And we had 2 virtual because of COVID. So 32 live conferences.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And how did this one compare to the previous ones?
Well, each one is unique because it's a moment in time, and it's all an evolutionary and co-evolutionary process in that way. But I think that, each year certain themes will spontaneously arise, or a certain kind of a vibe or a zeitgeist. And, when they ask me usually to, put some text together for what is either the theme or the context for the conference. And the main thing that came up for me this time was the, big wheels turning. And we're seeing this on every, it's kind of fractal from the, community level to the big wheels of ecological governance that are turning. And so we're in a period of massive change right now. And, I think, as my father-in-law used to say, if we had humility, we'd have everything. But, it's very humbling in the face of these massive processes that are underway. And I think the sense this time was that a lot of these forces that have been struggling and clashing so strongly, and with a lot of conflict, a lot of tension, are starting to now flow. And there's a sense of momentum, I think, that's actually building. And not in any way to downplay how dire things are, which they certainly are, and it's all very precarious and could go either way. But it could go right. And that's what in a talk that I gave, I asked, a friend of ours has a podcast called What If Things Go Right? And that really stuck with me. I thought it was a great idea. And a lot of things seem to be going right now. And I was just blown away to hear kind of the progress in different areas and how far things have evolved and matured now. And also the scale of these social movements. I mean, it's, with corporate media and mass media, there's a kind of a kabuki of stereotyping of, oh, you're a quote environmentalist or this or that or an activist. And, it just masks the depth, the intelligence, the power of what's really going on. And these movements are so much bigger, so much more sophisticated and nuanced and so much more mature at this point. And they're big. I mean, as I mentioned at one point, but the solid majorities of the American public are in favor of what we would broadly call progressive policies. And among young people, it's 2/3 to 3/4. I mean, it's not even close anymore. So the real issue is the democracy deficit, as Chomsky calls it, the disconnect between our political leaders and what majorities of people want.
Amazing. So what are some of those things that you're seeing that are going so right? And what are some of the things that get you most excited about this moment?
Well, I mean, not to sound too trivial, but it's very clear that the train has left the station for renewable energy. I mean, there's no turning back. And it's not to say the fossil fuel industry won't do everything in their power still to delay, deny, and pervert whatever is trying to happen. But it's over. And the markets have spoken. And that I'm just guessing. I mean, your guess is as good as mine, but my guess is things are going to start to move really fast now. And we're also, I think, seeing a next kind of leapfrog technological revolution in that regard toward clean tech, at large climate solutions. I mean, there'll be all kinds of crazy stuff, but there's going to be some really serious things that are going to make it much more accessible, much cheaper, much more widely available, and very quickly. And there are many places in the world that are not that advanced in that way, and that they can actually make that kind of a leap more easily. That's happening in India, for example.
Got it. And one theme that seems to have stood out as well from Bioneers is around rights of nature. Can you speak a bit to that?
Yeah. So I first became introduced to this in 2006 when Thomas Lindsay, who's an attorney who's now at the forefront of this, gave it his first keynote at Bioneers. And I knew his mentor quite well, who had done a lot of work around deconstructing corporate power, a guy named Richard Grossman. And I'd actually asked Richard to speak, and he said, I want to give it to the next gen. Let's have Tom speak. And so that happened to be the year that they were working in Pennsylvania. And they're only, I think, as of a few years ago, there were only something like 200 public interest lawyers in the entire United States, if you can imagine that. Wow. So all these communities that want representation for what we would call the public good, forget about it. But what they found was they were in this hamster cage where basically the only thing that environmental regulations regulate is environmentalists, as Tom puts it, that the whole system is designed against you. You can't really win at the end of the day. And so they were dealing with a quarry that was about to be built in Western Pennsylvania, which is farmland and traditional family farms, and actually a very red area, people with big belt buckles and quite conservative views. And the people said, if this is really just this losing game, why are we doing it? Why can't we do something else? And they said, why don't we give nature rights? And that was where that work started in 2006 in this very conservative community in Pennsylvania. And it really caught my attention. And it flips the paradigm. Nature now is property. You can go buy this house or this place or whatever it is and do whatever you want. And what this does is, in fact, nature doesn't belong to us. We belong to nature, which is, of course, a deeply indigenous viewpoint as well. And it flips the legal paradigm completely away from nature as property to nature as rights-bearing. And as human beings, we can act as trustees. And at the time, it's one of these things that, forget being on the radar screen. You might as well be a UFO. I mean, basically, in terms of any credibility or possibility that this could ever go anywhere. And over time, we've stayed with it and just watched it now become the fastest growing environmental movement in history. I mean, it's stunning. And because it is an indigenous paradigm, with qualifications, there are important differences, but because it is, indigenous peoples have actually stepped into the forefront of leadership now, which is also profound politically. And so it's happening all over the world. And I mentioned last year in Florida, in Orange County, which is the 30th largest county in the U.S. It's also home to Orlando and Disney World and Ron DeSantis and all the rest of it. Super conservative area. They got a right to, they were able to get a ballot initiative, so it's a direct popular vote. And it not only won, but it won with 89% of the vote.
Wow.
I mean, this is unheard of.
Right.
It just doesn't happen. I think it's a really important indicator that these things are transpartisan. When you get into these core, like, do you want clean water? Do you want air you can breathe? You know, do you want a stable climate? I mean, this transcends those kind of, binary politics.
Yeah, thankfully.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what's emerging elsewhere? So are we seeing other ballot initiatives, other areas that are trying to adopt rights of nature laws in their jurisdictions? Like what are the tea leaves telling you now?
Well, yeah, no, this is starting to happen all over the world now, but I mean, it has been for a while, but actually through a daisy chain of connections that originated with Bioneers in 2008, of course, Ecuador became the first country in the world to put it in its national constitution. And that's, I think, where we want to, head in this country as well. A tough gig, but not impossible. And our work, we started a project about 4 years ago with Bioneers. I get Tom Lindsay's newsletter, the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights, CDER. People should check it out. But they had done the constitution for the Ho-Chunk tribe in Wisconsin. And I saw that, and I just really had a flash that, oh, wow. I mean, first of all, this is fundamentally an indigenous paradigm, and it's an extraordinary opportunity for indigenous leadership because this is so sensible. And if you overlay a map of the key ecosystems in the country with a map of Indian country, there are enormous convergences of incredibly critical landscapes that obviously we want to protect. And then if you layer a carbon sequestration map over that in terms of what is most critical, how do you make these choices, what to try to protect when everything is under siege? And then lastly, if you overlay a political map of that, are the burdens of history simply too great in this place to ever move the needle? For example, or who are the allies there? What tribes are there? What other stakeholders might be there? What becomes possible? So anyway, we decided to take a flyer and launch a project. We have an indigeneity program within Bioneers that's Native-led. Two wonderful Native women, now 4 actually we have on our staff, but they really liked the idea. So what we did is we worked with Tom Lindsay and Mari Margill, the lawyers who were at the forefront of some of this. And we offered very respectfully to do workshops and trainings just to introduce these ideas and show some case studies and other things that had been done. And it was really well received, and people liked it. And so it's always evolutionary when these startups are messy and you have to learn a lot. And, you learn sometimes by making mistakes or sometimes not. And basically what became clear was a lot of it is really legal work. And when any tribe might decide to want to institute rights of nature, there's also going to be a backlash. And you do not want to lead people down the garden path, in terms of getting into something either they don't want or they're not ready for.
Right.
And every tribe is different, and it's going to have different cultural protocols or customs, or a different place, different kind of ecology. And so, there's a lot of nuance to how this goes about. But basically, what we've done together is worked with a whole bunch of lawyers, both in Indian law and then water law, all kinds of, many different aspects, and to understand, to put together a legal toolkit so that people have templates for how to proceed or examples that they can either customize or emulate. And now it's just spreading all over. We just had, we're working with the Wampanoag in Cape Cod, who want to basically bring back the herring, who have been, under threat, and give rights to herring. And then at the same time, that was co-arising in Alaska. And so we helped to bring together those two communities, actually just a few weeks ago. in Alaska to all meet and share strategies and begin to move all that forward. But it's going to be very interesting because people really intuitively kind of understand rights of nature. It's relatively easy to grasp. And, we don't own nature. Nature owns us. That's the truth. And frankly, whether we recognize nature's rights or not, nature's going to do what it does. And we got no say in that, beyond, disturbing it or something. So,
right. Yeah, we won't go super deep into rights of nature here because there's so much I want to talk to you about. But I would emphasize to viewers and listeners that, this theme around rights of nature has been popping up in so many of the different interviews, and it is a movement that is afoot and that is growing and is gaining more and more momentum. And certainly Bioneers has been early supporters and nurturing this space for quite some time. So hats off to you. And yeah, I mean, it just seems like from my understanding of the work you've been doing, and I've known you for many years now, Kenny, you see around corners. Like, you just managed to see things before the rest of us. And whether it was identifying Paul Stamets and his work in mushrooms and giving him a stage at Bioneers early on, to, bringing biomimicry into the fold and more prominently featured. How do you do that?
This is the water I swim in, so I have absolutely no idea. I mean, to me, a lot of times it's about simply paying attention. And if you're actually watching, the seeds of tomorrow are here right now. There are things that may just come completely out of the blue that you can never anticipate or whatever, but a lot of these things are there if you're paying attention. And I think it's very intuitive in a way. I mean, I try to learn a lot and I read a lot and talk to people and all that, but I really don't know.
And the indigeneity program that you mentioned, that Cara Romero and Alexis Bunton have done an incredible job leading. I mean, it is a defining feature now of Bioneers. I grew up in the Midwest, lived in California for a decade. I was never introduced to really a thorough understanding of Native American culture, or really had much exposure at all, let alone appreciation for the stories and the current presence of Native peoples, how much they can teach us, what currently is underway in these communities, how it intersects with the environmental movements, until Bioneers. Bioneers was really my first time having those experiences. Now I live in New Zealand in a completely different context, and luckily, much more prominent showcasing of Indigenous culture through the Māori lens in that country. But yeah, I feel like Bioneers, one of its central gifts to people who come to your events, watch your podcasts, your media, listen to the radio program, watch the videos online, is really this education about Indigenous culture and hearing the authentic voices from especially Native American tribes. Can you help me understand the history of how you've brought this into Bioneers, what you see as kind of the important lessons learned, and how you think about it now?
Sure. Yeah, some of these things, you don't understand it while it's happening, kind of, or in retrospect, maybe things make more sense, or we make sense of it somehow. But I grew up in New York City. My father taught at Columbia, so I grew up in the city, but he was a teacher, so he had 3 months off every summer. And we used to go up to Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket most summers. This was before it was cool or expensive. It was very low-key at that time. But basically, my brother and I just got turned loose all summer with our bicycles and our crabbing nets and our fishing poles and, lived outdoors, basically. And it wasn't until many years later that I had any idea what a profound influence that was on me. And just, for me, nature was it was natural, and it was sort of my church. I just loved it, and to observe and be in it, just be part of it. And so anyway, that was there. And in a way, that's, to me, part of what being Indigenous is. We're all Indigenous Earthlings. Hello. Got news for you. But, and then I I fled New York, stayed briefly on the West Coast, but I had been very involved politically in the '60s and came of age during the '60s, and the revolution sort of crashed by the early '70s, and it was a pretty disappointing situation. But I did not want to be in a city, and my first wife and I ended up. A friend said, "Oh, you should go check out the Southwest," and so we drove and landed in New Mexico and just fell in love with the land. And also, at that time, people would ask me if they needed a passport to come to New Mexico. It was very exotic, and nobody knew where it was or what it was. I thought you had to cross a border to get there. But it was more like living in almost northern Mexico than living in the States. And it's famous for being tricultural. So it's the Anglo community, which were the latecomers, really, and then originally the Indians, of course, the native people there, and then the Hispanics, who were the descendants of the conquistadores. It's not what people think of as Mexican or anything. And I, having grown up in New York City, I can't handle. I mean, I love multicultural, societies. So it just and I fell in love with the land, and I read a lot and learned a lot about native cultures through that, and would go to the dances, the feast days, and things. But it was, the communities were relatively segregated. I was making a feature film that was partly about botanical medicine, and ended up meeting this guy who was one of the co-authors of The Secret Life of Plants, which was a very popular book at that time and very daring in saying plants have feelings and sentience. And now we know that's all true, but not at the time. And anyway, we became friends. He called me up a few weeks later and said, "Can you make a film about a friend of mine in an Indian pueblo north of Santa Fe?" And it was a paying gig, which was important at the time. And so I didn't know what I was in for, but I thought I was there to make a film. But fate had other plans. This guy, Gabriel Howarth, was a master organic farmer. He was part Tarahumara Indian, but mostly hippie. And he had studied with the biodynamic farmer Alan Chadwick, who said, if you really want to learn about farming, go with First Peoples and apprentice if they'll have you. And he did that in Mexico and then Central America and Latin America. And as people began to trust him, they gave him what for them was the most precious of gifts, which was the gift of seeds. Because through the seeds speak the voices of the ancestors, and in turn, each time you plant a seed, you become the ancestor for generations to come. And I had lived on a small farm for about 6 years. The world is much better off without me farming, I'll tell you, but I enjoyed it. But this was a whole new world. It was biodiversity in the garden. And I had just started to learn about biodiversity and read E.O. Wilson and, understood much more about that. Anyway, biodiversity in the food system remains a critical issue, the lack of diversity in the food system. And as one day we were filming, and Gabriel had put the word out, which he always did through the Pueblo, does anybody have any old seeds? And one morning, this guy showed up on his doorstep with these red corn seeds, and no one knew. He didn't know what they were, so he went around the Pueblo, and only one elder actually remembered and said, "This is the sacred red corn of San Juan Pueblo," and it hadn't been grown in 40 years. And as I was standing behind the camera, and he started weeping, holding these incredibly beautiful red scarlet seeds up against the turquoise sky. And it was just one of those moments, of epiphany, and there it was. And, the traditional knowledge is as endangered as the seed stocks, if not more so, and preserving that is equally important. And Gabriel wanted to start some kind of a health and healing center, or, organic food and all that. And I wanted me to help raise money or get involved. And I said, that doesn't really interest me, but what about a seed company? And so we started this company called Seeds of Change, which was not only the first national organic seed company, but it was really backyard biodiversity, to reintroduce diversity into the food system through backyard gardeners, who are the ones who are really passionate about seed diversity. And so we started working with a bunch of native farmers and developing these relationships. And the first nonprofit program that actually preceded Bioneers was called the Native Scholars Program, to try to record and preserve this traditional knowledge of food, the seeds and the gardening and food systems. And then we started Bioneers in 1990. And for me, I mean, indigenous worldviews are the only worldviews that have ever made any sense to me, basically, along with probably Buddhism. But for one thing, the earth-based wisdom and knowledge, and then how to be a good human being. What's called the original instructions, just how to, and it's so much about community and humility. And if we're intelligent, it's because we're the fruits of this genius system that we're lucky to be a teeny part of,
Right.
and that made sense to me, all of that. So it's the first time I kind of felt at home in that way. And then we were in New Mexico, the Pueblos were never displaced from their land base. So it's a truly living culture in that way, not kind of a museum where not many tribes have been so colonialized or just decimated, and removed from their land base. And, it's hard to recover some of that. So anyway, the Native voice just became very, very important from the beginning. And Bioneers was a fluke. I mean, we didn't have a plan, and I'd never been to a conference, kind of beginner's mind, and just did what interested me and, what I wanted to learn about and hear about. And then 1992, which was the third year, was, of course, the 500th anniversary of Columbus. And so we did a meta indigenous program about the 500th anniversary and what that meant. And, from there, it just kept on going. And we ultimately, more and more Native people were coming to the conference, and we had a request from that community to have a sovereign Native space, which became the Indigenous Forum that would be Native-led and Native-directed. And people came to us very respectfully, but I guess they maybe thought we would say no or something, and we were so blown away and honored, and what a great idea, So that's where it started. And now it's just flourishing in its own right. It's a beautiful thing. So
Yeah, having had experience with both the conference and the organization, it's clear that you don't just have like an indigeneity department, within a traditional hierarchical structure and a couple managers of that team. I mean, what you've created is a really respectful, sovereign space, and created a lot of space for the forum, the Indigenous Forum at Bioneers, as well as the team and the indigeneity program, because it does a lot of its own fundraising. It runs its own budget within the organization, as I understand it. I know Cara and Alexis feel very empowered to make decisions, and I guess the proof's in the pudding in terms of the staying power of both the team as well as the people who keep coming back to Bioneers and keep building out the program, and the number of attendees that come from, I mean, how many different tribes are represented at Bioneers?
Well, for sure this year there were over 125 tribes.
I mean, where else do you find 125?
The United Nations.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah. I mean, incredible. And Bioneers, for those who aren't familiar with it, I mean, the structure is roughly 3 days of, in the mornings, there are keynotes inside of an auditorium. Incredible keynote speakers from all over the world, but especially, Turtle Island, United States, North America. And then in the afternoons, there are different panels and breakout sessions. And, the frustrating thing about Bioneers is that once it's time to go to the afternoon sessions, you can't, it's the paradox of choice. How can you possibly decide between so many great things and trying to be at so many places at once? And then all of the community collisions, because it's really just this gathering, this pilgrimage, this convening. I like to say it's like my Burning Man. It's like the Burning Man of the environmental space, where you go and then you're not sure if you're going to go back the next year because you've been so many times, but then you still find yourself going back year after year after year, because that's where all of your friends are and that's where all of these people are convening. And then of course there's after parties and concerts and different theater screenings and documentary films and you name it. I mean, it's not like a festival, like a traditional, music festival or anything like that, but it's very much a festival for the heart and mind, and people seem to consistently say that they just feel so like their cups get filled up from going.
Yeah.
Anything to add to that, or other reflections from your perspective on the Bioneers experience and how you've created this kind of container?
For one thing, our focus is on solutions. And it's not in any way to say that we don't squarely face the crises, the horrors that are going on, and the dread that we all experience right now, and all of that. But it's not about that. And I think that there's a kind of a vital life force behind it. And a lot of it is, of course, in the curation. But our job, in a way, is every morning we get up and do a star search for the most amazing work and people going on. And at any given time, that of course is always evolving and changing. And I think when you bring all of that together under one roof, so much of this work otherwise is siloed. And our premise from the beginning has been that it's all connected. This is one giant system, and humans and nature are one system. They're not two separate things. And so I think when you kind of spin the dial of the kaleidoscope and see all the different facets of the jewel, that just that the totality of seeing the bigger picture in itself is really powerful. And most people, in the activist world is difficult, and it's hard work for one thing, but you're also usually in a very focused space, and you don't have that sort of 50,000-foot view. So I think that's part of it. And then just seeing the unity and the convergence of how this stuff really is all connected. And I felt, for example, this year, there was just a sense of a kind of a group mind that came out of it. And to have a community experience in that way, where we're all going through this together. I mean, so it's a really profound transformational experience. I had so many people, including a lot of young people, say, this is life-changing for me, and it isn't just an intellectual thing or a mental thing. It's, as you said, it's very much the heart, but also it's a collective experience, I think. It's almost like, when going to a movie is very different from watching a video at home, and having that collective experience, there's a power. You feel the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And just to be, life is beautiful. Life is amazing. What a gift. Nature, oh my God, this is incredible. What's going on out there once you start to really get deep into it. And I think that it's so enlivening, and just life affirming in that way. I don't know, does that make sense to you?
100%. And I mean, my understanding is that this year, which was the first year at Berkeley, and congratulations on pulling that off. It's so hard to change venues. For a long time, it was in Marin. And then obviously you had to contend with the pandemic and a lot of uncertainty about the conference and the locations. But the feedback I've heard from, the attendees is just overwhelmingly, and unanimously supportive of this new location and the atmosphere that Berkeley has provided, and the just the resonance that it has with Bioneers. So hats off to you on pulling that all off, and the team obviously behind the scenes for all of the work. My understanding is, over 2,000 people were registered for the conference and came each day, and a very strong presence of youth. And you've always given out like lots of scholarship tickets to young people, to classrooms, to local schools here in the Bay Area. Can you share more about the kind of youth orientation?
Yeah. Well, we've done this for a long time, and obviously we want young people to come, but in the earlier days, we almost couldn't get them to come. I mean, the idea of going to a conference to them sounded really boring, and they were completely not interested. And it's hard to say exactly what changed, but I think for one thing, there was word of mouth about what a powerful experience it was for them. And then I just think there's more and more interest in the kind of stuff that we're doing, But there was a really interesting, and to be clear, I mean, we're a nonprofit organization, and the conference is a loss leader financially. We certainly do not make money, believe me.
Right.
But we're fortunate to have funding to be able to subsidize people to come, and that's just been a priority for us for a long time with young people.
Right.
But now we can't even keep up with the demand. I mean, so many young people want to come, and I think obviously this is more their world than mine in many ways now, and at my age, and they're so awake and aware. And as I mentioned, all these polls, if you read the data, 2/3 to 3/4 of youth are on what we would call the right side of every progressive issue and totally get the climate crisis and don't have to explain that. And so I think I'm just always so inspired. But we saw overall a demographic shift to a younger audience, with the majority of people being under 50 years old now. And that was a real sea change, actually. So I'm glad we're not old and in the way.
Yeah.
And, we're so conscious about next gen leadership now. And,
Right.
really, and at the same time, I think that's one of the things that's very unusual about Bioneers is it is in fact intergenerational. And actually talked to quite a few people this time who literally had 3 generations of their family there.
Wow.
And the grandparents had started coming, or the kids started coming and told their parents, and then now they've got kids, and so it's becoming a thing.
Yeah.
Which is
I mean,
really cool.
and for me, it was always a tradition to come with my mother.
Right.
When I was living in the Bay Area, she always really enjoyed Bioneers. I always enjoyed. We would come together, and yeah, it's so sweet. There was no other conference that we would ever do that together on. So you also make quite an effort to reach the people that can't come. Obviously people that are further afield or for one reason or another, accessibility, location, can't actually be here for the in-person event. You have full production teams behind the scenes capturing so much of the content that's happening on stage and in the panels. And you have a lot of content curation and publishing, and you yourself host a radio show. Can you share more about all of the Bioneers media and the initiatives that you're doing on that front?
Yeah. So, I had made a film, as I mentioned before, a feature doc before I started Season Change and then Bioneers. But I've always been a writer since I was a kid, basically, and I'd been a journalist before I did the film. And so when we had the original conference in 1990, we did audio tape it. And realized, and Nina also, who's the co-founder, has a background in theater and communications. And so we were very clear that we really wanted to get the voices of the Bioneers, out there in whatever form we could. In the early days, we did text and audio. And then in the early 2000s, we were fortunate to be able to get this radio show going. The media are just really important. We do a lot of short videos. We also post the keynotes, not just online, but it's on Free Speech TV and Link TV. And we're looking actually now at a number of sort of further and new media strategies. But, it's a big open question at the moment as to exactly what's most strategic to do. In that way, our newest project is called Bioneers Learning. And it's essentially online education, but it's what we call education for action with a community of leadership. The idea being twofold, that this is not academic education. This is something that was going to help you actually do stuff, how to, and actually hands-on. And if you're already doing stuff, how to do it better, how to do it more deeply, and at the same time to connect with allies, colleagues, networks. That's really what moves the work forward ultimately. It's not usually about one individual. It's about doing it with some kind of network or community. So the idea is to operationalize the transformation. How do you start a public bank? How do you do community wealth building? Or rights of nature governance, if you want to engage and become an organizer in your community, or if you're already doing it, how do you take it to the next level, whatever that might be. And then there's also a whole other component of that, which is really the inner work of, we're all dealing with PTSD, which I call permanent traumatic stress disorder now. I mean, anybody that's not feeling it is numbed out. This is, how do you process that? How do you work with that in a way that you can get up in the morning and not only function, but actually thrive? How do you develop your own leadership? What does that even mean? So there's a whole component. So anyway, we're just launching that next month, actually. And nice. I'm very, we'll see. But I think it's going to be very important. And I think there's a lot of, what we're seeing is, a lot of people had actually asked us, they said, okay, I'm inspired. I learned all this stuff. Now what do I do? And we never wanted to take that next step. So we're taking the next step now to actually help people to engage more deeply and do the work or do it, more effectively.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
And then I don't know. I'm kind of hanging out with other media stuff right now because the story of the battle is the battle of the story, right?
What do you mean by that?
Well, we're dealing with dueling narratives, and you look at what the other side is doing, and they have a massive propaganda effort. And we're all saturated with that. That's what doom scrolling is all about, and meant to disempower you, meant to make you despair, meant to give you delusion or conspiracy theories or whatever. And we've got to get our message out more and more effectively. And there are many, many ways to do that. But the question is what now becomes sort of most strategic. So I'm kind of hanging out with that, trying to, understand. But, we need to be kind of waves lapping on the shore. Take rights of nature, for example. It's actually a pretty simple concept to understand, but we should be doing PSAs and promotions just for the concept of rights of nature. And then on the other side of that, okay, suppose there's an initiative in Orange County, Florida. Why aren't we doing micro-targeting, and actually reaching voters? I mean, so I think there's a whole range of interesting things that could be done at this point.
Yeah. No, there's so much. And so we've talked a bit about the rights of nature work, the indigeneity, the media side. I'm curious, what are some of the other, and we talked also about the youth presence and the conference itself. What else is in grabbing your attention most from all these different themes that you're looking at, trends you're seeing, other maybe things that aren't yet within the popular lexicon that you sense are going to be more important in the future?
Well, really big picture. I mean, the federal thing is always going to be really important. However, I think a lot of where the action is going to be moving now is much more towards the local. And even just the concept of beginning to look at bioregions is really where the action is going to be. And do you know what watershed you're in? What is your food shed? What is your culture shed, for that matter? And nature builds from the bottom up. And that's a lot of what is going to bring resilience and stability going forward. So whether it's at the very small community level, at the regional level, the city, the county, the state, I think that's more and more where we're going to see real action going on. And it's also much more accessible often than the federal level is in terms of how gnarly it is to get involved. But one thing that I'm personally very interested in now is more and more states and cities and counties are actually woke or certainly awakening. And, I mean, we're going to be brought to our knees by the climate crisis here. This is not going away. It's only going to get worse. And people are going to have to deal with this, and that's already happening. So it's way past denial at this point, and that's not going to last much longer. So the real question becomes policy shifts, and how do you get into those systems? And so that's a lot of where I'm looking right now. And what I'm seeing is just not only openness, but people are really searching for new ideas and new ways of doing things. To give one example, the community wealth building work. Rather than the extractive corporate economy, which is pretty much hit and run, particularly at the local level. I mean, they're just pipelining the wealth out of town, to wherever HQ is. And the models that Laura Flanders talked about here at the conference this weekend of actually taking public money and investing it in the local, I think we're going to see a massive wave of that. And so that's one of the areas where it's an interesting thing of what are the policies that can be put in place, which we now have templates for, that will actually keep wealth in the community, build local businesses, allow for things, different forms from normal capitalist stuff in terms of cooperatives, worker-owned businesses. How do you distribute ownership at the same time that you're doing this? How do you start looking at transgenerational wealth creation? So it's not just you and your job, but your kids and your grandkids or other people's kids. I think that we're going to see more and more of those models start to take hold because they work and they make sense. And, it's a good, what I was saying about media, this is where introducing the media, well, what is community wealth building? This is important just to educate people. And in our experience of, 30 years of doing this, once people realize there are solutions, it leverages the pressure for change. It's like, oh, somebody did this. It's possible, So I think we're going to see more and more of that. And, another example, we're here in Berkeley now, and on the opening morning, the mayor of Berkeley came. I was really impressed with him. Super intelligent, really well informed. He'd actually done some homework on Bioneers and had some idea what we actually do. It was great. But here's a very progressive community where all kinds of things could happen. So one of some of our speakers this weekend were do work on it's an organization called GERI, the Gender Equity and Reconciliation Institute, and what it's really about is gender reconciliation and equity, exactly what it sounds like. But they took this to South Africa, which is perhaps the worst place in the world in terms of sexual violence. I think there's a rape every 33 seconds, literally, and incredible gender inequity. They were able to hook up ultimately with Desmond Tutu, and it went to the highest levels of the South African government, where they held these retreats where men and women come together in this deeply raw, honest format that's also very healing. It's about healing the wounds, not dwelling in them, but go through a very intensive process, and people come out utterly transformed. And that's the kind of thing that could become policy in a place like Berkeley or many other places. So, so we're looking at how to use the Bioneers learning. We'll keep it in Cynthia Bricks, who do that work. We'll be teaching a course on Bioneers learning. We already have radio shows. We have other media. We'll try to promote that to policymakers, public servants. There's a permaculturalist who's one of the elders in the field, Penny Livingston, and she does a gazillion online permaculture trainings. But I was kind of trying to go deeper with her, and I said, Penny, what are you not doing that you'd really like to do? He said, well, what I'd really like to do is teach permaculture principles to policymakers and politicians. Oh, yeah. Brilliant. Exactly. How to think like an ecosystem. That's the problem is between our ears, right? So there's just a lot of possibilities, and I think the openness is there now. These alternative models not only exist, but some of them are really starting to scale. The community wealth building is a really good example. So that's the kind of thing I'm really interested in now, is how to actualize all this stuff and actually, build it from the bottom up.
I'm curious, what are you finding in terms of messages that can be what you call transpartisan and solutions or ideas that seem to cross both sides of the way that we're currently doing electoral politics, that bind people together and kind of bring more cohesion to, especially in the climate space?
Yeah, well, I think the climate space in a way is taking care of itself in terms of global weirding and what's going on now. And this is not a passing thing, year after year, and getting worse and worse. And, ironically, much of this is happening in the Southeast right now. I mean, it's happening everywhere, but, politically, these are the worst places in terms of how they're being governed. But people are, I think, awakening to this is not a good thing. But in terms of your question, we had one of our speakers, Saru Jayaraman, who does labor organizing, and I think that's another example where I know she told this one wonderful story where they were having a Fight for 15 rally in New York City, and across the street there were some Trump supporters, and so she went over and actually talked to them, and when they found out that what they were talking about, the Fight for 15, they joined them, and to me that's really the crux of everything, because in the talk that I gave at Bioneers, I talked about oligarchy. And realistically, we're living in a corporate state. And so I think that that's the big issue. And it's not government that's the problem. It's corporate power. And I think there's more of an awakening to that now. But it's not where it needs to be by any means. But I'm startled these days by how many people are really questioning capitalism. You hear it as a common point of conversation, where that was not true even 2 years ago or 5 years ago. It's something's changing.
Yeah, I do completely resonate with this point that people seem more willing to talk about post-capitalism than even just a couple of years ago. I think I felt that in terms of within the circles and waters that I swim, where it's just much more comfortable to now have a conversation questioning the tenets of capitalism and what comes next, and whether that's iterative or revolutionary and so forth, I think is still more in the debate. But yeah, I guess just to also represent maybe not a slight counterpoint, but maybe like a additional jadedness about government itself. I just feel like there's so many of our root issues also seem to stem back into the institutions of government And maybe, one can make a case that capitalism and corporations have infiltrated, the halls of government so much that they're the root cause. But it does feel like those structures of government power are not serving us and not up for the task in many ways. And so, yeah, representing just my own voice, like thirsty for other alternatives outside of just those two choices between corporates and governments. Like, how do we collectively organize and coordinate? Because I do believe in humans, and I believe in the intelligence of people, and that we can do this better than either of those two, forms seems to offer us. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. No, I think it's a really critically important point, actually. And I think there's a couple of things. The center has moved so far to the right now that, again, it's this reality distortion field. And what the right has done is to monkey wrench the government, to make it ineffective, to make it dysfunctional, to the point that, I mean, this is not the way it was even Reagan was the one who really went after this. But before the 80s, things actually worked to some degree. I think there's a lot of different levels to what you're asking. One is there are institutions that are simply archaic. I mean, there's no way they're prepared to meet the challenges of the world that we now live in, and that's real. But I think, and this was interesting at the conference this weekend, where some of the inside scoop on how the investment, the Inflation Reduction Act got passed was amazing. But there were really brilliant, smart people way inside the Biden administration who actually had a good idea how to get these policies done. There's incredibly smart people and dedicated people working on this. So it is very possible to do that. In other cases, you really do need to reform or restructure the institutions. They're just old and in the way, and they're not going to work in the form that they're in. But I think the other aspect of what you're asking about is so much of the driver of what is working has been civil society. And it's not really talked about as almost a branch of, they talk about the press being the fourth estate. Civil society is a kind of a fifth estate in a way. And in fact, if government got out of the way and simply funded a lot of civil society, we're actually doing the work. I went to a lot of the sessions, and there were incredibly moving things. Reproductive justice, particularly for women of color. There are homeless women on the streets of San Francisco who are pregnant. I mean, how are they supposed to cope in any way whatsoever? And these people were doing incredible work to get a hotel room for these people, to get decent medical care, to help them with their pregnancy. And the civil society is doing this work left and right. Restorative justice. There's example after example. And if the government were simply, in effect, contracting, rather than with private business, but with civil society, that would be absolutely transformative. I mean, if there were, like what FDR did, another civilian conservation corps, like what the Sunrise Movement is kind of reviving in that way, it would be civil society that it would make sense. We're already in place. We're doing this stuff. Look at a group like Tree People in LA. Just give them the money and let them do their thing. So I think that's actually one of the most important, kind of tactical shifts that could happen right now. Nice. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. And you mentioned women's leadership, women's rights, gender equity a few times, and maybe that would be like the last area. I'd love to just understand a bit more of your perspective, because having traveled through some tech conferences recently and being surrounded by, very heavily male-dominated spaces, and then coming to Bioneers, it's a breath of fresh air to be surrounded by such a, I don't know what the percentages are, but my impression is that there's more women here than men. Yeah. As a conference organizer and as someone who cares deeply about gender equity, like how do you cultivate these kinds of environments? And I'm also like, maybe speak to people who organize events and conferences and how they can learn from what you've discovered at Bioneers, but also any broad, meta commentary about the role of balance between men and women and the moment we find ourselves in.
Well, there's a lot of layers to what you... Gee, thanks, Matthew.
Try to keep questions really simple.
No pressure. I mean, all these things, like real life, everything is complicated. But for whatever reasons, I think women in one way are sort of saner than men, particularly at this point in the world, as the life bearers and the people who bring life into the world and have a sense of future generations more than probably men do. I think that there's a survival instinct right now. And Kim Stanley Robinson talked about this in his talk, where he said, part of what he's witnessing is a fear factor right now, that at the highest levels of governance or corporations, there's a sense of dread. People get how serious this is now, and this is, this ain't no fooling around, right? And that's kind of a good thing in a way. But I think women are sensing that at a very, very deep level around the world. And you look at what's happening in Iran and so many places where women-led revolutions are really going on now. And so in terms of us and our little conference, that's organic. It's not like we do outreach to women per se. And I don't know the exact data. Before the conference, I think it was like 60% women coming, maybe even more. So I think there's an intuitive thing going on at that level. I would also make a distinction. You've also got a Margaret Thatcher. Being a woman by itself is not the criterion. But I think in general, we're going to see a whole surge ongoing of leadership from women, which, generally is going to be really good. So, but, I think so much of this comes back to still the structural impediments, and men have to be allies at this point. And I'm waiting to see, the Equal Rights Amendment come back. That would be a good start. That's the kind of thing that I think could be possible soon. And unless we change the fundamental structures and the laws, those do have a big determination on what goes on. So,
yeah, awesome. Well, yeah, that makes sense. And are there other themes that we didn't touch on, or questions I didn't ask, things you'd like to share?
Well, everything is really precarious. And at the same time, just my intuition, my gut feeling right now is that the winds really are shifting and the big wheels are turning. And we may be in for a decade or so of things starting to really move and to really flow. And the resistance will be savage. But the train has kind of left the station in certain ways. And some of these things are the past, they're history, quite literally. And the real question to me, it's kind of a game of beat the reaper here. The one thing that we need most is what we have least, which is time. I was talking with David Orr recently. He said he'd be really optimistic if we had another 50 years. And I would too. There's no question. You look at the demographic shifts in this country, and there was some talk this weekend about 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in the U.S., and they're going to move toward a Declaration of Interdependence now, which is something we've been pushing on since 1990, and it's great to see it reach critical mass. And so that consciousness is there. It's all happening. The question is whether it's going to happen fast enough. So that's the main, beat the clock here. But I'm more hopeful than I've been. And I think, in a way, you have to go through the underworld and the burdens of history, and there's a real purge that needs to happen, a real kind of a cleansing, and dealing with that shadow material. And I think that is happening. That's not where you want to land or where you want to dwell, but you got to go through it. And in a way, as a species, we're having a near-death experience right now, and near-death experiences are transformative, and there are no fake near-death experiences, as Rick Tarnas likes to say. It's for keeps, it's for real. So here we all are, and what I'm seeing is a lot of people awakening. So the question now is engagement and taking action, and it ain't going to happen by itself. And whatever your place in life is, whatever you're connected to, do what you can. For real. This matters. So,
Kenny Ausubel, 34 years. Congratulations on the amazing conference. Thank you also for just being the kind of leader and an emerging elder in our culture who keeps going. You haven't retired to the golf course. You haven't. You're not off the playing field. You're fighting for all of us. And I know Bioneers has had a profound impact on my life, many people's lives. And your ripples are certainly not always visible to you, but I know are felt by many of us. So thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, it's been an honor to know you and work with you for the past decade, Matthew. I love you, so thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I've seen so many positive ripple effects from the Bioneers community over the years. I'm just really grateful to Kenny for his time and his work in the world. You can learn more at Bioneers.org, where you can check out the Bioneers learning resources and also make a donation. You might also want to check out our conversation with Nina Simons, co-founder of Bioneers, as well as the other discussions we had at the conference. You can find all of those and more at maearth.com. We invite you to like, share, subscribe, join our community Discord. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.